There is a version of World War I that most people carry somewhere in the back of their minds. It involves mud, yes, and sacrifice, and the haunting image of young men going over the top into machine gun fire. It involves poetry, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, the poppies of Flanders fields. There is a kind of melancholy grandeur attached to it, a sense that the suffering was at least witnessed, at least mourned, at least understood by those who came after. That version is wrong. Not wrong in its details exactly, but wrong in its shape, wrong in what it leaves out, wrong in the comfortable distance it maintains between the observer and the thing being observed. The war that actually happened was not a tragedy in the literary sense. It was not structured like a story. It did not move toward meaning. It was an industrial process. And like all industrial processes, its most important feature was not its catastrophes, but its routines. The screaming moments were brief. The silence that surrounded them lasted 4 years. What follows is an account of 23 realities that became routine in that war. Not anomalies, not exceptions that the system failed to prevent. Routines. Things that happened so consistently, so predictably, so systematically, that the men who administered the war built paperwork around them. Forms, procedures, protocols, categories. The machinery of World War I did not break down under the weight of human suffering. It processed that suffering. It filed it. It stamped it. It moved on. Before the first shell was fired in August of 1914, the armies of Europe had already decided how many men they were willing to spend. This is the first thing to understand. The casualty projections were not afterthoughts, they were preliminary calculations. The French military had studied the wars of the 19th century and concluded that offensive action would succeed if the attacker was willing to absorb losses in the early phases of an assault. The German Schlieffen Plan assumed a rapid advance through Belgium that would require a certain number of men to die per kilometer of advance. The British Expeditionary Force, smaller than the Continental armies but professionally trained, had its own mortality tables. These were not secret documents. They were operational planning tools. The generals who would later be accused of sending men to slaughter with no thought for their lives had, in fact, thought about their lives quite carefully. They had calculated acceptable rates of loss, projected how those losses would accumulate over the duration of expected operations, and determined that the numbers were sustainable. The problem was not that the generals were thoughtless. The problem was that they were precisely, methodically thoughtful. And the conclusion of that thought was that hundreds of thousands of men could be absorbed by the machine without the machine stopping. The mobilization itself was the first routine normalization. In the summer of 1914, in the space of a few weeks, approximately 12 million men were taken from their lives, from farms, factories, offices, schools, from marriages and apprenticeships and ordinary Tuesday mornings. The logistics of this extraction were extraordinary. Trains ran on schedules that had been planned years in advance. The German military had railroad timetables that specified, to the hour, which units would board which trains at which stations on which days. France mobilized through a system of local conscription offices that had enrollment records going back years. Britain, which did not yet have conscription, ran a volunteer recruitment campaign of staggering efficiency, processing hundreds of thousands of enlistments in days. The machinery was ready. The men were simply fed into it. And the men went. They went because they were told to go. They went because their neighbors were going. They went because the newspapers told them it was necessary. They went because the alternative was social ostracism, legal consequence, or the simple inability to imagine refusal. The machine collected them, clothed them, armed them, transported them, and delivered them to the front. The machine did this without pause, without reflection, and without any mechanism for stopping if the calculation of acceptable loss turned out to be wrong. At the front, the first routine that required adjustment was the routine of dying in the open. The initial weeks of the war, August and September of 1914, were genuinely mobile. Men advanced and retreated across fields and through villages. They were shot in the open. They died in ditches and in farmyards. This was expected. What was not entirely expected was the speed with which both sides discovered that advancing across open ground against modern rifle and machine gun fire was not survivable at the rates required for breakthrough. The Germans dug in. The French and British dug in. By November of 1914, the Western Front was a continuous line of fortified trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 700 kilometers. And the digging never really stopped. The trenches that existed by 1916 were not the shallow scrapes of the first months. They were engineering projects. Communication trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, dugouts, bunkers, wire obstacles, forward observation posts, listening posts. The men who built them were soldiers, but they spent more time as laborers than as fighters. The routine of construction became as much a part of military life as the routine of combat, and within that construction routine, there was a quiet, accepted, never fully acknowledged reality. You were building your own prison. The trench was protection. The trench was also the thing that would keep you at the front, static, immovable for months or years at a time. The smell was the first thing that visitors to the front always mentioned, and then almost immediately stopped mentioning, because there was nothing useful to say about it. The trenches smelled of mud, certainly, of wet earth and rotting wood, and the chemical sharpness of exploded ordnance. But underneath all of that, and through all of it, and sometimes overwhelmingly above it, they smelled of human bodies in various stages of decomposition. This was not an incidental feature of trench warfare. It was a structural one. Men were killed in no man's land and could not be retrieved. Men were killed in the trenches themselves and could not always be buried immediately or safely or completely. The bodies of men killed in earlier offensives were sometimes entombed in the walls of trenches dug later. Working parties sent out to repair wire or dig new positions sometimes turned up human remains from previous engagements. The mud of Flanders, which became almost a poetic symbol of the war, was not simply earth and rainwater. It was earth and rainwater and the physical residue of human beings. The soldiers knew this. They knew it from the smell, and they knew it from what they sometimes found underfoot, and they knew it from the rats, which grew very large and were not afraid of people, because people were, in the context of the trench system, primarily a food source. The rats did not distinguish between the living and the dead with any particular urgency. The soldiers killed the rats when they could. The rats were never eliminated. This was accepted. The presence of decomposing human remains in the immediate environment of the living became, over months and years, an unremarkable background condition of existence. The lice were universal. Every soldier on the Western Front had lice. British soldiers called them chats. The process of removing them was called chatting. It was a social activity. Men would sit together in the brief intervals between duties and go through each other's clothing, crushing lice between their thumbnails. The sound of this was specific enough that men described it in letters home before the censors removed such details. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the folds of blankets, in the hair. They could not be permanently eliminated in field conditions. Delousing stations existed behind the lines where men could be cleaned and their clothing treated with heat. But the lice returned almost immediately upon return to the trenches. The physical sensation of infestation, the constant low-level irritation of being bitten, the inability to sleep cleanly, the knowledge that the insects feeding on you were the same insects that fed on the men around you and the men before you, became so normalized that soldiers rarely mentioned it except as a form of dark humor. The War Department developed protocols for managing lice. There were inspections. There were issued treatments. There were reports filed on the prevalence of infestation in various sectors. The lice were a managed variable. They were part of the operational landscape. Trenchfoot entered the medical literature of the war as a new condition requiring new diagnostic categories. It resulted from prolonged immersion of the feet in cold water and mud. The trench systems flooded regularly. Drainage was never adequate. In winter, water stood in the trenches for weeks at a time. The feet of men standing in this water began to change. The skin became white and numb, then red and swollen, then in advanced cases, gangrenous. In severe cases, amputation was necessary. The British Army lost tens of thousands of men to trench foot in the first winters of the war, and the condition represented a significant and quantifiable drain on fighting strength. The Army's response was characteristically bureaucratic. It issued orders. Daily foot inspections were mandated. Each man was required to have his feet checked by his NCO. Whale oil was issued for rubbing into the feet as a prophylactic measure. Dry socks were to be changed at specified intervals. Officers were held responsible for the foot condition of the men under their command. The condition never went away, but the Army had created documentation around it. There were forms to fill out when cases were identified. There were reports on the rates of trench foot per division per month. The suffering became a number in a report. The number was reviewed. The number continued. The rotation system deserves specific examination because it reveals something important about how the military managed the psychological sustainability of trench conditions. Men were not kept continuously at the front. They rotated through a cycle that moved them from the front-line trenches to support positions, to reserve positions, and occasionally to rest areas well behind the lines. The specifics of this rotation varied by army, by period, and by the intensity of operations in a given sector. In quiet sectors, a battalion might spend a week in the front line, a week in support, and a week in reserve before rotating back. In active sectors, during major offensives, the rotation could break down entirely, with men kept in forward positions for weeks at a stretch. The theory behind rotation was sound. It was an acknowledgement that continuous exposure to front-line conditions was not sustainable. The practice was something else. The rest areas behind the lines were not, in any meaningful sense, restful. They were locations where men were drilled, subjected to inspections, assigned to labor details, given limited alcohol ration, and returned to the front. The transition from the managed terror of the front line to the managed routine of the rest area and back again was itself a form of psychological disruption. Men reported that they often felt more anxious in rest than at the front, because at the front the threat was immediate and comprehensible, while in rest the threat was anticipated and therefore in some ways worse. The rotation system successfully managed the physical sustainability of the force. Its effect on psychological sustainability was more complicated and was never fully addressed. Shell shock was a phrase that entered common usage early in the war, and that the medical establishment spent the remainder of the war trying to suppress, redefine, or explain away. The initial clinical observations were straightforward. Men who had been near shell explosions sometimes developed symptoms that had no obvious physical cause: paralysis, blindness, deafness, uncontrollable trembling, inability to speak. The symptoms looked like the symptoms of physical injury, but examination revealed no injury. The first interpretation was that they were caused by the physical concussive force of shell explosions, hence the name shell shock. This interpretation was convenient because it framed the condition as physical, involuntary, and therefore unimpeachable in terms of a soldier's honor and discipline. But the condition appeared in men who had not been near shell explosions. It appeared in men who had simply been at the front for extended periods. It appeared in men who had witnessed the deaths of comrades, or who had been ordered to perform actions that violated the basic structures of human psychology. The medical establishment was forced to confront the possibility that the conditions of modern industrial warfare were, in themselves, pathogenic. That the experience of existing in the trench system, the noise, the helplessness, the constant proximity to death, and to the physical residue of death, was sufficient to produce clinical breakdown without any specific traumatic event. This was not a comfortable conclusion. If the environment itself caused psychiatric illness, then placing men in that environment was causing psychiatric illness deliberately. The Army's response was to create a taxonomy of conditions that avoided this conclusion. Shell shock was redefined, subdivided, reclassified. Some cases were labeled shell shock W for wound, meaning they were given the status of physical injury. Others were labeled shell shock S for sickness, meaning they were treated as medical conditions. Others were diagnosed as not yet diagnosed nervous, a classification that was essentially a holding category for men whose condition the system did not want to formally acknowledge. Men diagnosed with conditions in the second category were often returned to duty without treatment. Men who refused to return to duty faced court-martial. The number of men executed by their own armies during World War I is not a secret, but it is a number that sits at the edge of most popular histories of the war without being fully integrated into the story. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the conflict. France executed several hundred more. Germany executed its own men in smaller but still significant numbers. The offenses for which men were executed included desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, sleeping on post, and striking a superior officer. The trials that preceded these executions were, by any contemporary standard, procedurally inadequate. Men were tried in proceedings that lasted sometimes a few hours. Legal representation was limited or non-existent. Medical evidence about the mental state of the accused was frequently disregarded or was not sought. The decisions were reviewed up the chain of command but were rarely overturned because the system required a deterrent. The logic was explicit. If men could be shot for cowardice, other men would be less likely to exhibit cowardice. The fact that many of those shot were not cowards in any meaningful sense, that some were men suffering from what would today be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, that some were teenagers who had lied about their age to enlist, that some were men who had served with distinction before their collapse, none of this complicated the institutional calculus. The machine needed a deterrent. The machine had one. The executed men were sometimes buried in unmarked graves, and their families were not informed of the circumstances of death for years or decades, if ever. The British government did not issue a blanket pardon for these men until 2006. Friendly fire, the killing of soldiers by the weapons of their own side, was so endemic to World War I that military planners built it into their operational calculations. Artillery, which was the dominant weapon of the war, was not precise. It could not be made precise given the technology available. The problem was fundamental. Artillery fire was directed by observation, and observation in the conditions of the Western Front was extremely difficult. Smoke, fog, mud, the churned and featureless landscape of the bombardment zone all combined to make accurate fire control nearly impossible. The standard solution was to fire in such volumes that even inaccurate fire would suppress the enemy. This solution also inevitably killed one's own men. The creeping barrage, which was the technique of advancing a line of artillery fire just ahead of attacking infantry, was designed to protect infantry by suppressing the enemy ahead of them. It worked sometimes. It also killed significant numbers of attacking infantry when the timing broke down. When the infantry advanced faster than planned, or the barrage lifted slower than planned, or when the sheer volume of fire in a confined area made discrimination between friendly and enemy positions impossible. The British Army studied this problem and developed procedures to minimize it. Signal flares, advanced timing tables, communication protocols. None of these eliminated the problem. Soldiers going into an attack knew that they were moving into a zone of fire from both directions. The men who planned the attacks knew this too. The losses to friendly fire were folded into the total casualty figures without specific annotation. There were no reports filed on how many men had been killed by their own artillery. The number was absorbed into the larger number, and the larger number was reported as the cost of the operation. The gas attacks that began in April of 1915, when German forces released clouds of chlorine gas at Ypres, introduced a new category of suffering that the war would spend the following 3 years systematizing. The initial attacks caused panic. Men who had never encountered chemical weapons had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. The yellow-green cloud, the smell of bleach and cut grass, the burning in the throat and lungs, the suffocation. The medical facilities behind the lines were unprepared. Men died in large numbers. The military response to this new weapon was not to prohibit it. The response was to develop countermeasures, to develop offensive chemical weapons of their own, and to establish procedures for operating in a gas environment. Respirators were issued, improved, made mandatory. Gas drills were conducted. Gas sentries were posted. Systems for detecting and alerting to gas attacks were established. The introduction of phosgene, which was more toxic than chlorine, and mustard gas, which blistered the skin and eyes and lungs and lingered in the environment for days, required further adaptation. Soldiers became accustomed to the gas alarm, the rattle or bell or shouted warning, and to the procedure of masking in seconds. The ones who mastered this procedure survived gas attacks more reliably. The ones who did not mask quickly enough did not. The experience of treating gas casualties became routine for medical personnel. The wards full of men with destroyed lungs, with suppurating skin blisters, with eyes glued shut by inflammation, became a standard part of the medical landscape behind the lines. The men who treated these casualties developed protocols, procedures. The suffering was processed. The supply system was one of the war's great organizational achievements and one of its quiet atrocities. To maintain millions of men at the front, to provide them with food, water, ammunition, equipment, medical supplies, and all the other material requirements of sustained industrial warfare, required a logistics apparatus of extraordinary complexity. Railways, horse transport, motor vehicles, an entire administrative structure of depots, distribution points, and supply columns. This system worked. It worked well enough that the armies never collapsed from lack of supply, which was remarkable given the scale of the operation. What the system could not do was make supply humane. The rations that reached men in the front-line trenches were not always sufficient in quantity and were almost never adequate in quality. Hardtack biscuits, tinned bully beef, tea, occasionally bread that had passed through enough hands and enough mud before arrival that it was barely edible. Fresh food was rare. Hot food was a luxury. In the forward trenches, cooking fires were dangerous because they revealed positions, so men ate cold food or food heated by small solid fuel tablets when they could get them. The caloric needs of men living in cold, wet conditions, performing heavy physical labor, were significantly above what the standard ration provided. Malnutrition was not the norm, but it was not uncommon. The gap between what men needed and what they received was not a failure of the supply system. It was a result of optimized priorities. Ammunition came first. Food came after. This was a rational military decision. It was also a decision made by people who were not going to be cold and hungry in a trench. Letters from the front were censored. This is known, but the mechanics of that censorship deserve examination because they reveal how the institutional management of information operated at the most granular level. Officers were responsible for reading the letters written by the men under their command before those letters were sent. They were instructed to remove any information that could be useful to the enemy or that could damage morale on the home front. What was removed, in practice, was a great deal. References to specific locations were removed, references to unit movements were removed, descriptions of casualties that went beyond the general were removed, descriptions of medical conditions, of the environmental conditions of the trenches, of the psychological state of the writer or his comrades, were removed when they were too specific or too dark. What remained was a carefully managed version of the war. Men learned to write in a way that anticipated censorship. They wrote oblique letters, letters that communicated emotional states through the absence of description as much as through its presence. They developed private codes with family members. They wrote things and then crossed them out themselves preemptively because they knew the officer reading the letter would remove them anyway. The family at home received these letters and formed their understanding of the war from them. The understanding they formed was incomplete in ways that could not be measured, because what was missing from the letters was, by definition, absent from the record. The soldiers knew something that the people they loved did not know. The gap between those two knowledge bases was never fully bridged, not during the war and not after it. The management of the dead was one of the war's largest administrative undertakings, and it was an undertaking that changed as the war progressed and the bodies accumulated beyond any previously imagined scale. In the early months, men were buried where they fell, in hastily marked graves. As the front stabilized and the casualties accumulated, this became inadequate. The armies established graves registration units whose function was to locate, identify, and record the dead. The British Graves Registration Commission, which would become the Imperial War Graves Commission after the war, developed procedures of remarkable thoroughness given the conditions. Men were assigned identification discs. The discs were collected from the dead and used to generate casualty records. Burial parties worked under fire to inter the dead in marked graves. The paperwork generated by this process was enormous. Forms for each death, correspondence with families, lists, registers. All of this was designed to produce the organized data that would allow the Commission, after the war, to locate individual graves and to inform families of where their dead had been buried. The system worked imperfectly. A significant proportion of the dead on the Western Front were never identified. They were killed by artillery that left no body to find, or by fire that destroyed identification, or in conditions so chaotic that the record-keeping broke down entirely. The Thiepval Memorial in France, which commemorates the missing of the Somme, bears the names of over 72,000 men who were killed on the Somme and have no known grave. 72,000 names on a single memorial. Each name represents a man whose body was consumed by the industrial process without producing a recoverable artifact. The wounded survived at higher rates in World War I than in any previous conflict. This was a genuine achievement of military medicine, and it should not be minimized. The development of forward aid stations, casualty clearing stations, and base hospitals represented a systematic approach to trauma care that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Triage, the practice of sorting casualties by the urgency and treatability of their injuries, was developed and refined during this war. Blood transfusion techniques were advanced. Anesthesia was improved. The management of wound infection, which had been the primary killer of wounded men in previous wars, became significantly more effective through the systematic application of antiseptic techniques, though this remained imperfect in field conditions. All of this is true. It is also true that the higher survival rate of the wounded meant that more men survived with injuries that previous wars would have killed them from. The wards behind the lines and the hospitals in England, France, and across the Empire were full of men who had survived, but who would never recover. Men with one leg, men with no legs, men with injuries to the face that required reconstructive surgery, and sometimes received something that functioned as reconstruction, and sometimes received less than that. Men with internal injuries that produced chronic pain for the remainder of their lives. Men with damaged lungs from gas exposure who would die of respiratory complications within a decade. Men with neurological damage that manifested as tremors, paralysis, or cognitive impairment. These men were counted as survivors in the casualty statistics. They were not dead. What they were instead was a category of human cost that the statistics did not fully capture, because the statistics counted the living and the dead, and did not have a column for what lay between. The treatment of the war's psychiatric casualties underwent several significant evolutions as the scale of breakdown became undeniable. The early approach was to classify shell shock as either physical or moral. Physical cases were given rest and medical treatment. Moral cases, meaning men whose breakdown was interpreted as a failure of will rather than a response to injury, were subjected to a range of interventions that ranged from inadequate to actively harmful. Some medical officers simply returned men to duty after brief rest. Others applied what was called the forward treatment, which involved treating men as close to the front as possible, on the theory that returning them to a medical facility far behind the lines would reinforce their conviction that they were genuinely ill and make them harder to return to duty. The application of electric current to paralyzed limbs, on the theory that physical sensation would overcome conversion symptoms, was used in some facilities. The methods of W.H.R. Rivers at Craiglockhart, which involved genuinely therapeutic conversation and an attempt to understand the psychological content of the patient's distress, were exceptional. They were exceptional because they required time, skilled practitioners, and a willingness to treat the patient's experience as something worth attending to. The system had none of these resources in adequate supply. The system needed men at the front. The system's treatment of psychiatric casualties was calibrated ultimately to the goal of returning men to duty rather than the goal of restoring them to health. The two goals sometimes aligned. When they did not, the first took precedence. The conduct of major offensives followed a template that was repeated enough times that its elements became predictable to everyone involved. The preliminary bombardment, days or weeks of artillery fire designed to destroy the enemy's defenses, cut his wire, and demoralize his men. The men in the forward trenches waiting through this bombardment, deafened, unable to sleep, living in dugouts that might or might not survive a direct hit. Then the order to advance. Then the walk, because it was often a walk rather than a run, across no man's land toward positions that had been subjected to bombardment that was, in most cases, less effective than the planners believed. The wire was often not cut. The enemy was often not suppressed. He had been living in deep dugouts during the bombardment and had emerged to man his positions when it lifted. The men advancing across no man's land encountered this reality at the point of contact. The machine guns, the undamaged wire, the enemy who was still alive and armed and ready. The first waves died at rates that the men in subsequent waves could see from where they waited in the trenches. They went anyway. They went because the military system had processes for ensuring that they went. They went because the men on their left and right were going. They went because stopping would have meant doing nothing while everyone around them died, which was its own kind of unbearable. They went because the system had produced in them, through months of training and institutional pressure, a disposition toward obedience that was stronger, in most cases, than the instinct of self-preservation. And after they went, and after the offensive ended, whether it succeeded or failed, the reports were written. The casualty figures were compiled, the lessons learned were noted, the next offensive was planned. The Somme offensive, which began on July 1, 1916, and continued until November of that year, is the single engagement most associated in British cultural memory with the senselessness of the war. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, of whom approximately 19,000 were killed. This figure is repeated so often in discussions of the war that it has begun to lose its meaning. 57,000 casualties in one day, in one section of one front, in one war. To place this in context, the total American military deaths in the entire Vietnam War were approximately 58,000 over more than a decade of conflict. The British Army absorbed an equivalent number in a single day on the Somme and continued the offensive for 4 more months. The battle had been planned for months. The preliminary bombardment lasted 7 days. The assault was intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, to draw German reserves away from other sectors, and to break through the German lines in a decisive fashion. It did not achieve a breakthrough. It achieved over 4 months, an advance of roughly 10 kilometers at the cost of over 400,000 British casualties and comparable German losses. The plan was not, by the standards of the time, unreasonable. The execution was not, by the standards of the time, incompetent. The outcome was the outcome of an industrial system operating at full capacity in conditions where full capacity produced this result. The relationship between officers and enlisted men was structured by class distinctions that predated the war but were amplified and complicated by it. In the British Army, officers were drawn predominantly from the educated classes, from public schools and universities, from the land-owning gentry and the professional upper middle class. The men they commanded were predominantly from the working class, from industrial towns and agricultural villages, from backgrounds that had given them little formal education and no expectation of authority. The system required that these men obey officers who were sometimes younger than them, sometimes visibly less experienced in practical terms, and always separated from them by a social distance that the war did not eliminate, and in some ways reinforced. Officers ate separately. Officers had separate quarters when quarters were available. Officers received different rations. The differential mortality of officers and men is a complex statistical question, but what is clear is that junior officers, the lieutenants and captains who actually led men over the top, died at extraordinary rates. They were required to lead from the front, to be the first over the parapet, to move through fire while their men followed. The social code that required this meant that the upper-class young men who held these positions were systematically placed in the most lethal positions in the army. The class system that had created them as leaders also consumed them. By mid-war, the officer corps was being drawn from progressively lower social strata, not because the army had changed its class preferences, but because the original officer class was running out. The role of women in the war's economy has been well documented in subsequent histories, but was managed carefully at the time in ways that limited its disruptive potential. Women entered the labor force in large numbers, taking jobs in munitions factories, in transport, in agriculture, in nursing, in administrative roles that had previously been reserved for men. The women who worked in munitions factories, filling shells with explosive compounds, were exposed to toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and damaged their livers. They were called canary girls by those who noticed the yellow tinge. The work was dangerous, with factory explosions killing workers in numbers that were managed through the same protocols of official silence that managed other forms of civilian casualty. The women who performed this work were paid less than men had been paid for the same work. They knew they would be returned to domestic roles when the men came back, and they were told this explicitly by labor agreements negotiated with trade unions. The economic mobilization of women was complete enough to be operationally essential and incomplete enough to avoid the structural changes that would have been required to make it permanent. The women worked. The shells were filled. The men went back to work after the war. The institutional arrangement was preserved. The psychological effect of industrial killing on the men who performed it has been documented in memoirs and oral histories, but was almost entirely absent from official records during the war itself. The soldiers who operated machine guns, who fired artillery, who used flamethrowers, who participated in trench raids whose purpose was to kill enemy soldiers at close range, were not provided with any institutional framework for processing what they were doing. The military training had prepared them to kill. It had not prepared them for the experience of having killed. The aftermath was private and unacknowledged. Men described in post-war accounts the specific visual memories they carried, the faces of men they had seen die, the sounds of wounds, the particular quality of silence after bombardment. These memories were not processed in any official context. There were no institutional mechanisms for what would now be called debriefing. Men returned from trench raids, from firefights, from offensive operations, and resumed the routine of trench life without transition. The psychological material was carried internally. It accumulated. The men who survived the war carried these accumulations with them for the rest of their lives, in silence, because the cultural framework of their time provided no language for describing what they had experienced that did not sound either like complaint or like boasting, and they wanted to do neither. The medical category of neurasthenia, which the war expanded enormously, had existed before 1914 as a diagnosis applied primarily to upper-class men and women who suffered from various forms of nervous exhaustion. The war applied this diagnosis to men from all social classes in vast numbers, and in doing so revealed the extent to which the condition was not a product of class sensitivity, but a product of sustained psychological stress. Men who had been miners, factory workers, agricultural laborers, men whose class position did not previously entitle them to the luxury of nervous collapse, were collapsing in large numbers. The army handled this through a combination of treatment and suppression. Treatment, when it was provided, was often brief and aimed at returning men to duty. Suppression took the form of not recording psychiatric casualties in ways that would reveal their true scale, of reclassifying men as physically ill when their symptoms had psychological causes, of returning men to the front who were, by any reasonable clinical standard, unfit for duty. The total number of men who suffered significant psychological harm from World War I has never been definitively established because the recording systems were designed to minimize rather than capture this figure. Post-war pension records, which required men to demonstrate psychiatric disability to receive compensation, provide a partial picture. The partial picture is already enormous. The full picture, if it were recoverable, would be larger. The armistice that ended the fighting on November 11, 1918, did not end the war's consequences for the men who had fought in it. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, which killed more people globally than the war itself, moved through the armies and the populations they returned to with the efficiency of a disease spreading through large concentrations of men who had been weakened by years of exposure, malnutrition, physical stress, and immune compromise. The men who survived the shells and the gas and the mud returned home, and some of them died of influenza within months of the armistice. The demobilization itself was chaotic. Men who had been fed and housed and given a social role by the military for 4 years were returned to civilian life without transition assistance, without treatment for their physical and psychological wounds, without any systematic mechanism for reintegration. The labor market could not absorb them all immediately. The social world they returned to had changed in ways they had not witnessed and did not fully understand. The women who had worked in their absence were being returned to domestic roles. The political order was rearranging itself. The veterans, millions of them, had to find their way back into a world that had moved around them. Many could not. The suicide rates among veterans were not systematically tracked. The rates of alcoholism were not tracked. The rates of domestic violence, of chronic unemployment, of early death from war-related health conditions were not assembled into a coherent picture until long after the fact, if then. The peace treaties that formalized the end of the war began to generate their own pathologies almost immediately. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, imposed conditions on Germany that were designed to punish, to compensate, and to deter future aggression. The reparations demanded were set at levels that German economists said at the time were impossible to meet. The territorial provisions stripped Germany of significant portions of its pre-war territory and population. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, assigned to Germany and its allies full responsibility for the war and all its consequences. The men who negotiated this treaty were not fools. Many of them could see the potential consequences of the terms they were agreeing to. John Maynard Keynes, who was present at Versailles as a British Treasury official, resigned and published a critique arguing that the treaty's economic provisions would destabilize Europe. He was largely correct. The resentments produced by the treaty's terms did not produce a peaceful Europe. They produced a Europe whose subsequent political history was shaped in large part by those resentments. The men who had survived the trenches lived long enough to see the consequences of the peace they had been told they were fighting for. Some of them would fight again. Their sons, in many cases, would definitely fight again. The machine had not been dismantled. It had been paused. The disabled veterans of World War I required a new social infrastructure that did not exist before the war, and that most societies created inadequately and unwillingly. The scale of physical disability produced by the war was without precedent. Hundreds of thousands of men with lost limbs, hundreds of thousands more with compromised pulmonary function from gas exposure. Men with facial injuries who could not appear in public without causing distress in those around them, and who were therefore, in practice, excluded from ordinary social life. The prosthetics industry developed rapidly during and after the war. Artificial limbs of increasing sophistication were produced, fitted, and distributed. Organizations were established to assist disabled veterans in finding employment. Pension systems were created. All of this was real, and in some cases effective. It was also never adequate to the scale of the need. Men with severe disabilities lived in institutions or in private circumstances of significant deprivation. The pensions provided were rarely sufficient for comfortable living and were subject to review, reduction, and elimination when governments faced fiscal pressure. The men who had given their bodies to the industrial process were given, in return, a bureaucratic acknowledgement of their sacrifice and a monthly payment that reflected the government's assessment of how much their missing limb, their destroyed lung, their shattered face was worth in pounds, shillings, and pence. The memorialization of the war began during the war itself and accelerated in its immediate aftermath in ways that shaped the public understanding of what had happened. The language of sacrifice, of noble death, of dying for something larger than oneself, was available and was used extensively. The monuments erected in towns and villages across Britain, France, Belgium, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere were designed to commemorate the dead in terms that gave meaning to their deaths. They died that we might live. They gave their lives so that freedom might endure. This language performed a function. It allowed societies to absorb the loss of hundreds of thousands of young men without confronting the specific circumstances of those deaths. A man who died in a memorial is a man who died for something. A man who died because an artillery shell landed in his trench while he was eating his rations is a man who was killed by the random indifference of an industrial process. The first version is easier to live with than the second. The monuments chose the first version. The monuments were correct to make this choice in terms of social function. The choice also meant that the actual content of the war, the mechanized, bureaucratized, desensitized reality of what had happened, was not what the public memory preserved. What the public memory preserved was the sacrifice. What the sacrifice had been sacrificed to was more ambiguous, and that ambiguity was not carved into the monuments. The official histories of the war, produced by the military establishments of the participating nations in the years after 1918, were documents of extraordinary scope and questionable honesty. The British official history ran to several volumes written over decades. It contained enormous amounts of accurate tactical and operational information. It was written by men who had access to the records, who had often participated in the events they were describing, and who were also, necessarily, members of the institution whose conduct they were assessing. The decisions that had led to catastrophic losses were described in language that maintained institutional credibility. The failures of intelligence, of planning, of execution, were acknowledged in terms that attributed them to the fog of war, to the limitations of available technology, to the unprecedented nature of the challenges faced, rather than to the kinds of failures of judgment and institutional rigidity that a truly dispassionate analysis would have identified. The men who had given the orders that sent thousands to their deaths were given the benefit of the doubt that the system gave to its own. The official histories were not lies. They were documents produced by an institution about itself, and they reflected the interests of that institution in the same way that all such documents do. The long shadow of World War I, as historians have come to call its extended influence on the century that followed, operated through multiple channels simultaneously. The political instabilities produced by the peace settlement, the economic disruptions produced by the debts and reparations, the psychological damage carried by millions of veterans who had no language or institutional support for processing what they had experienced, the social changes produced by the massive mobilization and demobilization of labor, the technological developments accelerated by the demands of industrial warfare, the normalization of mass death as an instrument of policy. This last point is perhaps the most consequential and the least examined. World War I demonstrated definitively that industrial states could absorb casualties in the hundreds of thousands without the political systems that generated those casualties collapsing. The states survived. The government survived, with some exceptions. The military institutions survived. The strategic concept of attritional warfare, of winning by killing the enemy faster than he could kill you, survived. The lesson that might have been drawn, that attritional warfare between industrial states produces casualties that no political objective could justify, was not the lesson that was drawn. The lesson that was drawn was technical and operational. Better tactics, better artillery techniques, better coordination between arms. The machine was improved. The next time it ran more efficiently. In the final accounting, which was never really finalized because the accounting categories were never designed to capture everything that needed to be counted, the war killed approximately 17 million people, military and civilian, soldiers who died of wounds, soldiers who died of disease, civilians who died of starvation, of disease, of direct military action. The number does not include the additional deaths produced by the influenza pandemic, which moved through the weakened populations of a war-exhausted world. It does not include the deaths produced by the Russian Civil War, which was enabled by the conditions the World War created. It does not include the deaths produced by the Turkish campaigns against Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian populations, which occurred in the context of and were enabled by the chaos of the World War. The 17 million is the number that was counted. It was a large enough number that it should have meant something definitive. It did not mean something definitive. The same states that had produced it continued. The same institutional structures that had managed it continued. The same logic of national interest, military necessity, and acceptable loss continued. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 in the morning. Soldiers on both sides of the line knew it was going to end at that specific hour because the armistice had been negotiated and the time had been set. In the hours before 11 o'clock, artillery fire continued. Both sides continued firing until the moment the armistice took effect. Men died in those final hours who would have lived if the firing had stopped when the armistice was signed rather than at the time agreed. The number of men who died in the final morning of the war has been estimated at approximately 11,000. 11,000 men in a single morning after the peace had already been agreed because the paperwork specified a time and the machine ran until the time came.